Let me remind you, just as way of introduction to our fall series, about what our ministry focus is for this next year. Each year, we start with a ministry focus, and as we seek to live 6-8 together, this year, we would like everyone to experience the radical love of Jesus in such a fresh way that we can't help but pour out ridiculous amounts of love on the people of this city. And when I was thinking about that focus, about us experiencing God's love in a fresh way in the spring, there was no question what I needed to speak on this fall. And so this fall, we're doing a series called The Prodigal. And we're going to spend every Sunday, but this Sunday and our two special Sundays, Thanksgiving and Remembrance Day, but every other Sunday up into Advent, we are going to spend in Luke chapter 15. It's an amazing chapter. And my prayer is, as we go through Luke chapter 15, that every single one of us will get a fresh experience of God's love, a fresh understanding of who God is, and then a fresh experience with His love. But as last spring I was planning this series, I don't know whether it was the Spirit of God or just me, but I had this strong feeling that I needed to start the series not in Luke 15, but with another prodigal, a guy named Peter. So let me ask you some questions this morning. Have you ever flunked a class or bombed a test? Don't put your hand up. Have you ever got cut from the team? Ever got rejected for a date? First time I ever asked my wife out for a date, you know what she said? She said, I can't go out, I got to wash my hair. True story. That's rejection, failure. Have you ever got fired? Have you ever had a business fail? Have you ever had a relationship blow up? You see, here's the truth. Everybody experiences failure. Let me tell you, I've experienced many, but let me tell you about a funny one. See this monkey? It's a clapping monkey. It's pretty cool. You turn on music, it claps. Guys, don't ever give your sweetheart that gift on Valentine's Day. It's a really bad idea. It is a Valentine's fail. I know from personal experience. In fact, we were out for dinner the other night, and I was telling my wife I was going to tell this story, and I said, yeah, that's the worst anniversary present I ever gave you. She says, it wasn't anniversary, it was Valentine's Day, and I remember. And so, yeah, fail, big time. But the truth is, everybody experiences failure. It's inevitable, it's universal, it's really part of being human. Do you know, this is one thing I love about the Bible. The Bible's filled with failures. Noah. God says to Noah, Noah, I want you to go build a big boat because it's going to rain. I know it's never rained where you built this boat, but I want you to go build a boat. So Noah goes. He spends years faithfully building this boat. The flood comes. When Noah gets off the boat, you know what he does? He goes and gets drunk and naked, which I guess you might want to do after being on a boat with animals for that. But nevertheless, talk about a fail. How about David, the shepherd? David the king. David, the man after God's own heart. He has an affair with Bathsheba. And if that isn't a failure enough, then he goes and he covers it up by killing Bathsheba's husband. Fail. The Bible's full of people who failed. Then there's Peter. Matthew 26. After Jesus and his disciples had finished a meal, they headed over to the Mount of Olives, where Jesus said to his remaining 11 disciples, because Judas was out of the picture, listen what he said. He looked at these guys, his key followers. He looked at them and he said, this very night you will all fall away on account of me. Now, Peter, whose mouth was usually 10 seconds ahead of his brain, in a very prideful, self-confident spirit, said, even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. In other words, Jesus, those guys are wimps. They're going to fall away, but not me. I'm not going to fall away. To which Jesus responded, truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. To which Peter replied, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And after their conversation, Jesus is arrested and he's led off to be tried, and Peter follows behind. And at one point, Peter gets cold, so he sits by a fire and he warms himself. Let's pick up the story in Matthew 26. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. You also were with Jesus of Galilee, she said, but he denied it before them. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. He denied it again, catch this, with an oath. I don't know the man. After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away. Then he began to call down curses. He swore to them, I don't know the man. Immediately, a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. He went outside and he wept bitterly. Peter blew it. And notice his response. He went outside and he wept bitterly. Proud, confident, Peter had failed big time. Now imagine you're Peter. Imagine that. You're with Jesus and you're saying, Jesus, I'm the one. I am with you till the end. Forget these other guys. I'm there. I'll die with you. And then you deny him 3 times. The rooster crows and you're crushed. That failure just puts you right in the ground. You're suddenly overwhelmed with shame and with guilt. And you weep. Chances are, you can recall a time in your life when you failed big time. When that sense of failure overwhelmed you. When it caused you shame and guilt. When it caused you to beat yourself up. Have you ever had that? You go in for an interview for that dream job. And you walk out knowing you can blow it. And your head's down. And you're overwhelmed with failure. I blew my chance. You have an affair and it blows up your marriage. And you're overwhelmed by guilt, failure. If you're a parent, have you ever said something to your kid and you felt like a total loser after? I'll never forget, as long as I live. I was standing in the doorway of my oldest son Eric's room. He was just a little guy. I can picture him and what he was wearing right now. And I was mad at him. I have no idea why I was mad at him. But I raised my voice and I raised it too high. And you just see his eyes looking at me. Dad, why are you yelling at me? And I left that room and I felt like a total and complete loser. I'd failed as a parent. You ever experienced that? Maybe you're here today and you can relate to Peter. Because Peter blew it and he knew it. But then go over to John chapter 21. This is important to understand the context of John 21. Everything in John 21 happened after Easter. Everything in John 21 happened after Easter. After the disciples had a series of encounters with the risen Jesus. So it's a little surprising to find Peter in John 21 back fishing. Why is he fishing? He's encountered the risen Jesus. He's had an experience with the resurrected Christ. Why is he back fishing? Listen, if you ask Peter if he believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, I'm sure he would have given you an orthodox answer. I'm sure he would say, I know he's risen from the dead. I've seen him alive. But I'm equally sure at this point in his life, Peter was certain that the resurrection had nothing to do with him. Peter had lived 3 years with Jesus. He had heard stories about prodigals coming home, hookers finding forgiveness. But Peter thought that stuff applied to others, not him. He denied Jesus. He had denied the risen Jesus. He failed. He was washed up. He had the chance to do something great. But when the moment came, he blew it big time. And he's thinking to himself, how could Jesus ever use me again after what I've done? And so he went back fishing. What other option did he have? And some of you may be feeling just like Peter today. You're thinking, I failed big time. I destroyed my relationship with my spouse. My addictions have cost me my job. My kids may never speak to me again. My parents may never trust me again. I betrayed a friend. I've blown it sexually. I failed. I'm washed up. And you may be thinking today those stories about prodigals coming home, about people finding forgiveness and restoration don't apply to me. I've blown it. Here's Peter, the failure. He's fishing with some friends, and it's around sunrise, and they see this dimly lit figure walking along the shore. And this figure shouted out to them, "Have you caught any fish?" And they replied, "Nothing, not one." Peter can't even catch fish now. What a loser. And then this figure said, "Throw your net on the other side of the boat." And when they did that, their net got so full of fish, it began to break. And at that moment, John, who was fishing with Peter, said, "It's the Lord." Now, how did John know that dimly lit figure on the beach was Jesus? Well, it's because the situation they found themselves here in John 21 was an echo of something that happened to them 3 years earlier. If you go back to Luke and Luke chapter 5, you'll see the story where Jesus came upon some fishermen who had been out fishing all night. And he asked them how the fishing was. And they told him that they had not caught a fish. Now, I like this because every now and then the Bible has this little silent humor that's there. Now, catch this. These guys, these professional fishermen, they're out fishing all night. They haven't caught anything. And then along comes Jesus, a Jewish carpenter. And he tells these exhausted professional fishermen to go back out into the water and fish some more. These fishermen were pros. And pros only fished at night. They didn't fish during the day. If they did what Jesus was telling them to do, they knew that all they would catch is a sunburn. And yet, for some reason, don't know why, Peter said to Jesus, "Because you asked, we will do it." So they went out and they fished, and they caught so many fish that another boat had to come along and help them haul all the fish in. And so you go back to John 21, and John, who was there in Luke 5, realizes at this moment that he is experiencing deja vu. And he knew then that dimly lit figure on the beach was Jesus. And so he shouted out, "It's the Lord." John's comment, and those very full nets, took Peter back to that moment when Jesus was so compelling to him, so totally worthy of everything in his life that he'd given up his fishing business to follow him. And he was so filled with emotion that he jumped out of the boat into the water and he swam to shore. And as he walked onto shore, he could smell the charcoal fire. Now, here's something interesting. In John 21, John actually says there was a charcoal fire. Why would John say that? Why wouldn't John just say there was a fire? Do you know the word charcoal is only used twice in the New Testament? Once here to describe the charcoal fire that Jesus had made. The only other place it's used is to describe the fire that Peter sat by the night he denied Jesus. You see what's happening here? Peter jumps out of the boat, he swims to shore, and he starts to come up onto shore, and he smells the smoke from the charcoal fire. And what's that going to do? It's going to bring back all those memories. It's going to bring back that sense of failure. It's going to bring back the shame. It's going to bring back the guilt. It's going to bring back those 3 denials. Everything's going to come flooding back in as he smells that smoke. And then here's Peter. He's sitting by the fire. And he's smelling the smoke. He's remembering the failure. And sitting next to him is the guy he abandoned. Do you think there was a little tension in the room there? What do you think? And what happened next? What didn't happen next was as important as what happened next. What didn't happen was this. Jesus didn't bring up Peter's failure. Isn't that amazing? I know if I'd been sitting next to the fire, I would have looked at Peter and go, Peter, you're a loser. Thanks for supporting me. I thought you were going to die with me. Way to go, you bonehead. I say, you're washed up. We're finished. That's what I would have said. That's not what Jesus said. In fact, when you read it, it's amazing. Jesus didn't say anything about Peter's past failures. Rather, he talked about the present and the future. Here's Peter sitting by the fire, and all he's thinking about as he's breathing in this smoke is his failure. And the guy sitting next to him, the risen Jesus, isn't thinking about Peter's past because he's more interested in what Peter could become than all the things that Peter had done wrong. Listen, please catch this morning. This is so important to catch. Jesus is more interested in your future than your past. Jesus is more interested in your future and your past, and some of you need to hear that. He's more interested in what you can become than in all the things that you've ever done wrong. And so here they are, having Peter and Jesus are together, and look what the conversation goes like this, John 21. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt and probably a little annoyed at that moment because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Isn't that a great question? Do you love me? Let me ask you this morning, if you take Peter out of the situation, you put yourself, there's the fire, there's Jesus, there's you instead of Peter, and Jesus looked at you and said, do you love me? How would you respond? You know, my prayer is, by the end of this series on the prodigal, that you're going to be so overwhelmed with an understanding of God. You're going to be so overwhelmed by God and His love and His grace for you that you'll have no trouble saying, if Jesus was to say to you, do you love me? You say, of course I love you, because I understand who you are and I understand your love and your grace for me. That's my prayer. That every one of us will be able to say an affirming yes to that question. Now, did you notice something? How many times did Peter deny Jesus? 3 times. How many times did Jesus ask Peter, do you love me? 3 times. Did you see that? You see what Jesus is doing here? He had Peter make a 3-fold affirmation to cover over or counter his 3-fold denial. And notice what Jesus told Peter to do: feed my lambs. take care of my sheep, feed my sheep. In other words, Jesus was saying to Peter, Peter, you're not washed up. You're not a failure. Peter, I have a purpose for you. I have something important for you to do. I've got a role for you to play. I want you to lead and teach and take care of my followers. And then in verse 19, Jesus said to Peter, follow me. Jesus once again extended an invitation to Peter to follow him, just like he did in Luke chapter 5. Jesus forgave, restored, and recommissioned Peter. He gave Peter a fresh start. And listen, that encounter that Peter had with Jesus changed everything for him. The guy who thought that Jesus was through with him, well, just a few weeks later in Acts chapter 2, we find Peter standing in front of thousands of people, boldly preaching about the man he denied just a few weeks earlier. And when Peter was done preaching that day, 3,000 people decided to follow Jesus. Peter just didn't have a message. Peter was a message. A living message about the hope and the freedom and the forgiveness and the restoration that the risen Lord can bring. Now, here's something really important to remember about the story. So important. Peter's not the hero of the story. Jesus is. Jesus is the hero of the story. Jesus brought the hope and the freedom and the forgiveness and the restoration. He wants to be the hero of your story. And He wants to bring those things into your life. And because the hero of the story in Peter's case was Jesus, Peter came to understand this, that failure is an event, not a destiny. And maybe you're here this morning and you failed. You failed financially. You failed relationally. You failed professionally. You failed, who knows, there's a million ways you can fail. And maybe that failure has brought you remorse and regret and anger and shame and guilt. And maybe that failure happened to ways in the past, but even today, you're continuing to beat yourself up because of it. And you've come to church, you've heard the stories, you know that prodigals come home, you know that Jesus can bring forgiveness, but you don't believe that that applies to you because you feel you're washed up. A couple of years ago, I met a fellow who went through a divorce. He sat across the lunch table from me and said, I've blown it. I failed. I'm done. I'm washed up. I don't think I'll be good for anything anymore. I had to talk to him about Peter. But maybe you're feeling that way today. Listen, I want you to hear this. Jesus is more concerned about your future than your past. Jesus is more concerned about your future than your past. He is more interested in what you can become than in all the things you've ever done wrong. Jesus wants you to know, please believe this, Jesus wants you to know that your failure is an event, not a destiny. And when Jesus looks at you, He does not see a failure. He sees a beloved child of God. He sees a story that isn't over yet. And I believe Jesus brought some of you here today so He could say to you, I want to tell you, you are not washed up. You don't have to be a slave to your failures anymore. I want to set you free. I have a purpose for you. I have something significant for you to do. Your story isn't finished yet. Do you believe that the one who forgave and restored and released Peter 2,000 years ago can do the same thing today? Listen, Jesus is the same yesterday and today and forever. The question isn't whether Jesus can release you and restore you and forgive you. The question is, will you allow Him to work in your life? Will you allow Him to give you a fresh start today? Listen, I close with this. There's no failure. There's no addiction. There's no relational meltdown. There's no problem that's too big for our God. This is a new day. God is about to do a new thing. Let's pray together.